83-year-old Frank Martinez grips his mop handle tighter as the young cadet laughs. "Hey, old man, you missed a spot by my boots." What the kid doesn't know is that those old hands once flew fighter jets over Vietnam, and tomorrow morning, the base commander will call him by his real rank for the first time in 20 years. Frank Martinez pushed his grey mop bucket down the long hallway of Peterson Air Force Base, his worn boots making soft squeaks against the polished floor. At 83, his back stayed straight despite the years, and his silver hair was still cut military short. The early morning shift suited him fine. Fewer people around, less noise, just him and the quiet work of keeping things clean. He had been the night janitor here for 15 years now, ever since his wife Maria passed, and the empty house became too much to bear. The base felt like home in a way that surprised him. Young airmen and cadets walked these same halls where he had once served, though none of them knew that. To them, he was just Frank the janitor, the old man who cleaned their mess halls and emptied their trash cans. His uniform was simple navy blue coveralls with Frank stitched above the pocket. No ribbons, no rank, no signs of the life he had lived before. That was how he wanted it. Simple, quiet, invisible. Frank had joined the Air Force in 1960, fresh out of high school in San Antonio. Back then, his hands were steady and his eyes were sharp, perfect for flying. He spent 2 tours in Vietnam, piloting F-4 Phantoms on missions that pushed him to his limits. The jungle canopy below looked like green carpet from 30,000 feet, but he knew the hell that waited underneath. He never talked about the missions that went wrong, the friends who didn't make it back, or the nights he woke up hearing engine alarms that weren't there. After Vietnam, he stayed in the service, working his way up through the ranks, 28 years total, ending as a full colonel before he retired in 1988. Maria had been his anchor through all of it. She understood the nightmares, the long silences, the way he sometimes stared at nothing for hours. When she got sick, he took care of her the same way she had taken care of him. After the funeral, their house felt too big and too quiet. The janitor job wasn't about the money. His military pension covered everything he needed. It was about having a purpose, staying busy, being around the familiar sounds and smells of military life. It kept the loneliness away and gave his days structure. Most importantly, it let him serve again, even if nobody knew it. The trouble started on a Tuesday morning in the cadet training wing. Frank was mopping near the bulletin board when a group of young cadets walked by, their voices loud and careless. The leader, a tall kid with perfectly pressed uniform and an attitude to match, noticed Frank working. "Hey, old man, you missed a spot by my boots," the cadet said, pointing at a perfectly clean section of floor. His friends laughed like it was the funniest thing they had ever heard. Frank looked up briefly, nodded, and moved his mop over the already clean area. He had learned long ago that some battles weren't worth fighting, but the cadet wasn't done. "Look at this guy," he said to his friends. "Probably never did anything important in his whole life, just pushing a mop around, living off government handouts." The other cadets joined in. "My dad says guys like him are why the military budget is so high," one said. "Dead weight taking up space." Frank kept working, his jaw tight but his hands steady. He had faced enemy fire over North Vietnam, but somehow these kids' words cut deeper than he expected. He thought about his medals locked away in a box at home, about the commendations and the battles and the friends who never made it back to hear insults like these. The worst part came when the lead cadet kicked over Frank's mop bucket, sending soapy water across the floor. "Oops, sorry, old man. Guess you'll have to clean that up too. Maybe try to do it right this time." As they walked away laughing, Frank stood in the puddle of dirty water, gripping his mop handle so tight his knuckles went white. In that moment, he felt every one of his 83 years. The disrespect burned, worse than any physical pain he had ever felt. These kids were training to be officers, future leaders, and this was how they treated people they saw as beneath them. Frank stood alone in the hallway, water soaking through his work boots, and felt something break inside his chest. Not anger exactly, but a deep sadness that settled in his bones like winter cold. He had served his country for 28 years, had flown through enemy fire and brought his wingmen home safe, had buried friends and carried their memories for decades. And now, he was just an old man with a mop who got laughed at by kids who had never heard a shot fired in anger. He bent down and started soaking up the spilled water with paper towels, his knees creaking as he worked. The hallway was empty now, just him and the mess they had made. For a moment, he let himself remember what it felt like to walk these halls in uniform, to have young airmen snap to attention when he passed, to matter. The memory of Maria came to him then, her voice soft in his ear. You always mattered, Frank. Service isn't about what people see or what they say. It's about what you do when nobody's watching. He finished cleaning up the water and wrung out his mop. The job wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work. He had always been proud of honest work, whether it was flying missions or mopping floors. These kids would learn respect eventually, or they wouldn't. Either way, he had work to finish. Over the next few days, the incidents got worse. The same group of cadets seemed to go out of their way to make Frank's life difficult. They would track mud through areas he had just cleaned, leave trash scattered around the break rooms, and make loud comments about lazy old janitors whenever he was nearby. Frank said nothing. He cleaned up their messes, emptied their overflowing trash cans, and kept his head down. But other people on the base started to notice. Senior Master Sergeant Rodriguez, who ran the cadet training program, saw the disrespect and felt sick about it. He had tried to talk to the cadets about proper behavior, but they brushed him off. The breaking point came on Friday afternoon. Frank was cleaning the main assembly hall, getting ready for a big ceremony the next morning. The same group of cadets came through, and this time they weren't content with just words. They started throwing wadded-up papers at him, laughing as he bent to pick them up. One of them, emboldened by the others, walked up and knocked Frank's cleaning supplies off his cart. Chemical bottles hit the floor, and the smell of cleaning fluid filled the air. That's what happens when you don't pay attention, old man, the cadet said. Frank looked at the mess, at the broken bottles and scattered supplies, and something in his face changed. For just a moment, the mask slipped, and anyone who knew how to look would have seen the steel underneath. But the cadets were too busy laughing to notice. Word of the incident spread quickly through the base's senior staff. By evening, it had reached the ears of someone who mattered, someone who had been waiting for the right moment to act. Saturday morning arrived with the formal ceremony Frank had been preparing for all week. The main assembly hall was packed, with cadets, officers, and distinguished visitors. Frank worked in the background, making sure everything was perfect, invisible as always. The ceremony began with the usual speeches and presentations. Then, Base Commander General Patricia Hayes stepped to the podium. She was a no-nonsense woman who had earned her stars through merit and grit, and she commanded absolute respect. Before we conclude today's ceremony, she said, her voice carrying, across the silent hall, I want to address something that has come to my attention. Some of our cadets have forgotten what respect means. They have forgotten that service comes in many forms. The cadets who had been tormenting Frank shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Several senior officers turned to look at them with expressions that promised consequences. Frank, still in his work clothes, was cleaning near the back of the hall when the general's voice cut through everything else. Colonel Frank Martinez, please come forward. The hall went dead silent. Frank's mop clattered to the floor as every head turned toward him. The cadets who had been laughing at him all week looked like they had seen a ghost. Colonel Martinez, the general continued as Frank walked slowly toward the stage, his work boots echoing in the silence. Silver Star recipient, Distinguished Flying Cross, 2 tours in Vietnam, 28 years of honorable service to his country. Frank reached the front of the hall and stood at attention, his back straight despite his years. The general looked directly at the group of cadets who had tormented him. This man is a war hero, and you've been treating him like garbage. The hall erupted in applause as Frank stood at attention, his worn work clothes somehow looking like the finest uniform. Officers and cadets who had walked past him for years without a second glance now saw him clearly for the first time. The cadets who had tormented him looked sick, their faces pale with the weight of their shame. General Hayes wasn't finished. She ordered the offending cadets to the front of the hall, where they stood in a line facing Frank. Each one had to look him in the eye and apologize, not just for their behavior, but for failing to recognize the honor that had been walking among them. The lead cadet, the one who had been the cruelest, could barely get the words out. "Sir, I'm sorry, sir. I didn't know. I had no right to treat you that way." Frank looked at each young face, seeing his own younger self in their shame and confusion. When the apologies were finished, he spoke for the first time in front of the assembled crowd. "You didn't know because I didn't tell you," he said, his voice steady and strong. But respect isn't about knowing someone's rank or their history. It's about treating every person with dignity because they're human beings trying to do their job. The ceremony ended with a standing ovation that lasted 5 minutes. Frank Martinez, the invisible janitor, had finally been seen. Frank went back to his janitor duties the next Monday, but everything was different now. Cadets nodded respectfully when they passed him in the halls. Officers stopped to shake his hand and thank him for his service. The young people who had once ignored him now saw him as a teacher, someone whose quiet example showed them what real strength looked like. He still pushed his mop and emptied trash cans, but now he did it with cadets volunteering to help, eager to learn from the man who had served his country in war and peace. The work was the same, but the respect was real. Frank kept Maria's picture in his coverall pocket, and sometimes he would touch it and smile, knowing she would be proud. He had found his purpose again, not just in the work he did, but in the lessons he taught simply by being himself. True honor, he had learned, wasn't about recognition or rank. It was about serving with dignity, no matter what uniform you wore or what job you did. Some battles were won with weapons, but the most important ones were won with character, patience, and the quiet strength to keep going when nobody was watching.